Okay, we're going to use this online session to continue reviewing for the exam. So I had previously given out a study guide and I went through the quantitative problem that had been given to you on Wednesday. And so just in reviewing that, I wanted to give you some more questions, not to try to confuse or to sort of add to your preparation, but really to give you a chance to see multiple examples so that you could understand that these problems all come down to the same few factors. And so essentially it is going to matter, if you get a setup for a market and I tell you what the supply price response and the demand price response is going to be, right? The slope that multiplies price here and here in the supply and demand equations, that is going to be critical in almost all the answers. Okay, and so that's why I'm giving you these additional examples, or I gave you those additional questions at the end of this handout that I gave out Wednesday, because I wanted to be clear that was the point, not that doing the math that is, if you read through here, you see a lot of attention is given to these calculations. Well, the calculations are fine, but what's most important is that this ratio right here, this 80% versus 20%, those depend on the supply and demand price parameters, or the price, the slope that we're given. So what I'm going to do here, we talked through all the problems, or the example problem on Wednesday. I want to go through these additional questions that I gave you and think about those. So what I have are a set of notes, and I'll just sort of like I would be writing on the board, except you'll have the handout there you can look at and you can listen to me, and then I'll be pointing to different things in the handout as I go. So let me switch over to that, and we'll kick this off. Okay, let's start with question 1. So it says there's an income subsidy. It's on the consumer side, and it's decoupled. And so our definition of decoupled at this point just means it doesn't work to change the price, and it is not triggered by the quantity. Okay, and so it's not some kind of normal tax that we would see or subsidy. It's a blanket subsidy to income. And so when income is shifted, people tend to spend more. And so the demonstrated effect, I'm just saying, you don't have to worry about the specifics of how the policy was enacted or works, but in the market that we're going to analyze, for every price there will be more quantity demanded, and then the basic outcome that you have to deal with is the intercept moved from 500 to 550. You got 3 questions, okay, and think of these as follow-on to the original question from the study guide. So back to this question, right? So the original condition was here, 500, and these 2 values for the slopes, and now what we've seen is the value of that intercept has moved from 500 to 550. So 3 parts here. 1, how does this affect the equilibrium price and quantity? Not too difficult to think through. How does it affect the consumer and producer surplus, and then how does it affect elasticities at the market equilibrium? So we'll deal with all 3 of those now. Okay, I think I mentioned in class, and maybe even I drew this in class, my first inclination when I get something like this to look at is to graph it. I just want to see the predictions that could be made by producing a graph. And so you can see here that I drew our initial equilibrium at a price of 10, a quantity of 100. The intercept was up here at 500, and then I expanded it. I shifted the demand curve up to reflect the income subsidy, and I know that the intercept has to go to 550, and I drew the new demand curve. Okay, and so I can see that the price will go up when we shift demand out, and the quantity will go up. Okay, and these are not to scale, right? So approximately 1 centimeter here equals 50, and 1 centimeter here equals 1. And so these are not quantitatively to scale, so you would want to be careful in saying that one went up more than the other. But what you can see is that this is approximately 11. So if I've done a good job keeping the scales consistent down here, my prediction looks like about a price of 11 and a quantity a little bit above 100. But we have the algebra to deal with what we have to deal with. Okay, so we got this new intercept after the demand shifts. That's the information that we need. Okay, the income subsidy part is now out of our hands. So when you get to our market, the way the income subsidy shows up, C is increased by 50 units, 500 to 550. That's it. That's how we're going to analyze this policy, is just with this shift to demand. We have a formula for price. I don't know why that's written so ugly, but that's, I think my pen maybe was dying. But that is the formula for linear supply and demand price at equilibriums. You can always use it, and you can start from there. You don't have to go through all the algebra to generate that. This is not market economics class or price analysis class. This is policy. We know that's a price equation for a linear supply and demand. We plug in our values. 550 is the new value. Everything else stays the same, and that does generate a price equal to 11, and the price increases by 1 unit. Take the equilibrium price. You can always plug that back into the supply or demand equation, and it should give you the correct result. So the slope of the supply curve is 10, the new price is 11, and we get that the quantity increases by 10 units. That's all you need from part A, right? I do encourage you to do both the algebra to get the numerical result, and then to write a short explanation. Don't just say 11 and 110, but write in words. Do the communication step. The price increases by 1 unit, because this is about the effect, right? The question is actually specific, saying how will that affect the price equilibrium, price and quantity, equilibrium price and quantity. So do that, just because it'll make your answer better, it'll make your thoughts better as you move through the question, and it gives me something to give partial credit for if you mess up the math. You just saying that the number is 105 because you got it wrong, it's hard for me to do anything with that. But if you say that quantity increased, well, that's 80% of it, right? That's the biggest thing to note, is that the policy shifted the market quantity out to a larger level. Okay, the second part B, says what happens to, or how will this policy, this subsidy, affect consumer and producer surplus? In the math, we can think of two things. If you go back and review, and you should be able to, you can bring total surplus equations with you, per producer surplus, consumer surplus, however you want. But the things that are going to change in those are this value for capital C, which is the intercept of the inverse demand curve, and we're going to get a new value for Q star. So if you look through the equation that I'm going to use for total surplus, it is the intercept of the inverse demand equation, capital C, minus the intercept of the inverse supply equation, which is 0. Okay, and so that's what I'm working from. I guess if you were going to calculate producer surplus and consumer surplus individually before doing anything else, you might also add that the new value for P star matters. So you'd have 3 things that are going to change. So just, I want to be clear that the way I'm solving this means that I really only deal with two parts. To get that value of C, we need to reapply our formula of negative C over D to get capital C. So it's now negative 550 over negative 40, and you'll see that's 13.75. Remember, you can have a calculator. It just needs to be a basic, it needs to be a non-phone calculator. That's the only requirement. And you need to have whatever's out on your desk you can't use to communicate with someone or surf the internet. So that's the value I needed for C, and then I need the new value of Q, which I'm using there. So total surplus equation, 1/2 times capital C minus capital A, those two intercepts of the inverse supply and demand equations, times Q star, And if you do that, you see a half times 110 is 55 times 13.75. And that has a value. It looks like I didn't bother to calculate it. But if you don't want to calculate it, that's fine, as long as you can tell me that that's bigger or smaller than something else. So I know if the old quantity, this would have been 50 times, what was the value? 12 and a half, right? And so I know that this is unambiguously larger. I'd probably need to calculate that out. So let's see how I actually work through this. So, okay, yeah. So I noticed that this was 55, and from the slope of the supply and demand curve, I know that 80% of the surplus is going to producers and 20% goes to consumers. And so I use that fact to say that producer surplus is going to be 80% of the total surplus, and this term right here is the total surplus. So I take the total surplus from there. I know producers get 80% of it, and I know that 80% of 55 is 44, and so it looks like I did do the math down here. So 44 times 13.75, again, if that is a problem, if that's the only thing you get wrong because you didn't have a calculator or anything, I don't care if you can't solve that. I mean, for your own sake, be sure that you can do products, just because, I don't know, maybe you're in a job interview and somebody asks you to multiply something, or maybe you impress them by multiplying something. So be able to do that. But on this test, it's not going to cost you anything. Let's keep going. The consumer surplus, what did I do? Okay, I know that the producer surplus is 80%, the consumer surplus is 20%, or in this case, it's just going to be 1/4 of the producer surplus, so I just multiplied 1/4 times the producer surplus, or in this case, divided it by 4, and I got it to be 151.25. And so when I wanted to sort of show the impacts, I put the original producer and consumer surplus here. After the income subsidy, we go to 605 and 151.25, and I calculated those two changes. Important for this, I hate to scroll so much, but this income subsidy problem does not have deadweight loss in this market. So when people talk about income taxes or income subsidies and they ignore deadweight loss on the spending or this market side, it's because there is none. There's no deadweight loss to find here. Okay, you just get this net effect, and it produces more quantity, more, and a higher price. Right, so it's just a win-win. Now, if you want to go find the deadweight loss, go back to the labor market, where you are now. For every hour someone works, or for every week someone works, you're giving them slightly more money. There'll be some deadweight loss there. Or if you tax someone's income and they respond by changing the way they work, that labor market, you'll get that. So we'll talk about labor markets because they're very distinct in the second part of the class, basically on farm labor. Question C asked you about how the elasticities change, and I think I already talked about this one on the board on Wednesday, but let's just revisit it. I know for a fact from my notes and from the math we did that the elasticity of supply will be 1 for a linear supply equation when the intercept is equal to 0. And so since we didn't change A, that supply elasticity didn't change. And previously, when I did the elasticities in the first question, I saw that because B is plus 10 and D is negative 40, the elasticity of demand will always be negative 4 multiplied by the elasticity of supply. And so here we have the elasticity of demand is just going to be negative 4. So these elasticities don't change. Remember, only two things can change an elasticity. One or both of the slopes make adjustments. The price response actually changes, or the ratio of the price to the quantity at equilibrium adjusts. Neither one of those changed in this problem. Remember that we had 10 over 100 and then we changed it to 11 over 110. Both those ratios stayed the same, and so since those don't change, the elasticities remain the same. So What does that mean? It means that any taxes you add after the income subsidy, the response is exactly the same as if you're looking at the previous market. Okay, the effects aren't going to adjust. The share of a tax paid by producers, the share of a tax paid by consumers, if you did that following the income subsidy we just considered, they don't change. So essentially, this demonstrates that an income subsidy, if you're worried about deadweight loss or effects in this market, an income subsidy is a great way to boost out this market. Okay, I think we're ready for question 2 now. A policy announcement restricts the use of key productivity input. So think about it as a chemical input that maybe controls competing weeds or pests of some sort. Something that competes. But just as a generic example, let's say it's because of the dangers to human health. So it's either a restriction on where it can be applied, when it can apply, or the amounts, however you want to think about it. It's not specific, but the demonstrated effect. So the way it's going to show up in our market, we're thinking about an input use. How does it affect the supply in our market? And we get two things. So, the basic effect is the supply has to be less elastic. Okay, so you're now less price responsive because you're losing an input that was key to productivity. The slope is going to fall from plus 10 to 0.8, and the intercept is going to go up to plus 20. So B, lowercase b, is going to fall to plus 8. Lowercase a is going to increase to plus 20. Assuming there's no change to the demand behavior from the base case, which is our initial demand curve. So I'm basically saying ignore question 1 when you're doing question 2. Of course, on the exam, you would only have one of these or the other, so you wouldn't even be having to think about it. Answer these questions. So how does this affect price and quantity at equilibrium? How does this affect the price incidence of a potential subsidy in the supply, a subsidy in the market? And then on the price incidence, how do you expect the surplus to affect? So basically saying you can use get to question B, do the price incidence, and then use that to explain part C. Okay, so let's see what I did here. Okay, back on this. Question 2, policy has 2 impacts that were described to us. Again, we don't have to go back and think about, is the policy good or right? We're just asking, this is the quantitative section, so we're just trying to come up with the quantitative impacts, and I'm asking specifically for some. So 2 impacts that enter into our market. First, the shift of the intercept, and then the sort of tilt or the degree of the slope is going to change to plus 8. And so again, I like to graph these things, so I tried to get this on here, and you can see it. So the demand curve doesn't stay the same. We were explicitly told that. And we had an initial supply curve that looked like this. It was a little bit steeper, and it started from 0, and then, this is probably not perfectly to scale, but the new intercept is higher at plus 20, but the supply curve part 2, or the shifted supply curve, is flatter. Okay, so it's almost rotating around this point. And I've drawn it through the point 10, 100. That was the initial equilibrium. It's kind of cheating because I already knew that the solution was going to be the same, which is question A, right? So if you were drawing this, either be very good at graphing so that you take it through that point, or draw it generically and then and just say that I know 2 things happen. At some point, these are going to cross, and one's going to be beneath the other, whereas on the other side it'll be above. Okay, so it looks like the graph doesn't change the solution. Let me check the algebra. Again, I start from P star all the time in these problems because we've already solved it once, and it's generic, right? You tell me these 4 things for a linear supply and demand system, I'll tell you the price, and then I'll find the quantity. Work through it. 500 minus 20, because this changed, the intercept of the supply curve changed to 20. 8 this used to be 10, now it's 8, and so we end up with this new ratio of 480 over 48, and that's just a value of 10. Plug that in for Q star, you get 20, which is the intercept, plus 8, which is the new value for B, or the slope of the supply curve, times the price that we just found there, and you get 100. So PQ are the same as they were. For part B, I go straight to the price incidence equations, and I talked about this in class on Wednesday as well. Write these down, use them however you like. I mean, this part has to stay the same. All right, so it's the producer price, the free market price, plus the demand slope over the supply slope minus the demand slope. This factor, this coefficient, is unyielding, right? Then put a variable out here for the policy, however you like. So this question says, what if there's a subsidy in this market? And if I make this P star plus D over B minus D, then D is negative and will tend to push the price down below, it'll push the producer price below the free market price. Well, that's not what happens with a subsidy. So this variable S must be less than 0 when it's a subsidy. Okay, if you're subsidizing in this market, S is something that's less than 0 the way this is written. And so I just be sure to note that out here, that when I'm talking about a subsidy, I'm talking about negative S here, so that negative S times this factor, which is negative, will push the producer price above P star. And if it's negative here, it has to be the same thing here, right? So these are the two price incidence equations, and of course the key part are these two factors. So just, I don't know how to tell you other than memorize it or have it in your notes, but we work through all the math to show that the numerator here shows up as the demand, the slope of the demand curve. So when we're doing the producer price, the numerator shows up as the demand slope. When we're doing the consumer price, the numerator shows up as the supply slope. Okay? So we got these two incidence coefficients. In the original case, we had B and D, 10 and negative 40. Now we have plus 8 and negative 40. So let's work from those. And we can say that the producer incidence for the original case was 40 over 50 was 0.8 for producers, and for consumers it was 10 over 50, 0.2. After the policy, after this this new regulation or whatever it is we're talking about that makes supply more inelastic, the producer incidence changed from 40 over 50 to 40 over 48, and that comes out to be 5/6. I think it's probably, what, 83% roughly, 83 point something, 83.3 probably. The consumer incidence went from 1 over 5 or 8 over 40, 10 over 50 to 8 over 48 or 1 over 6, and that is going to be whatever 100 minus 5/6 is, so 16.6. Yeah, and then for the change out here, if you want to do this, if you don't, it's small, right? Just say small increase, small decrease. The key part is that they go up by the same, this one goes up by the same amount this one falls. That is what has to happen. But of course, the true value here is 130, 1 over 30, sorry. So it was about 80%, now it's about 83%, and 1 over 30. So what happens? Supply becomes more inelastic. Again, I'm given a table that records the result, but I want to be sure that, if I'm writing an exam answer, that I give just a couple of notes here that explain my table and the sort of process in a way that I'm clear about how I'm answering the question. Okay, so the question said, what are the impacts on the price incidence, producer and consumer? And so, part of the advantage of starting from these equations, is I don't have to do a lot of work to develop those, but it means that I need to do a little more communication when I get to the end and say, okay, I worked from these price incidence equations, I saw that supply was going to be more inelastic. And so what I did was I calculated the producer of share of a subsidy will be larger now. It's going to be larger by that factor, plus 130. That change is going to be completely offset by on the consumer side, they will get a reduced share in the subsidy, equal but in the opposite direction. Okay, question C. Must be about surplus. So it says, based on what you just calculated in Part B, using that price incidence, how do you expect consumer and producer surplus to be split in this market and show any work? Well, the producer surplus measures should be shared in the same way. Okay, so the incidence is just a way of putting in price terms what we see when we draw the supply and demand graph. So let's go back to the supply and demand graph, and so you know that as we think about a quantity adjustment to this side, we'd be talking about a tax, or if we talk about one on this side, we'd be talking about a subsidy, and that the impact on demand or supply is going to be dependent on the impact on demand or supply prices is going to be determined by those incidence factors, but also these areas that we want to calculate, so the gains or losses to producers and consumers. So if the subsidy looked like this, right, so between the supply and demand curve, right, so this is on this side of the market, we're pushing the quantity up. That is how these supply and demand curves that tell us the price for producers is being pushed up, the price for consumers is being pushed down, will give us the same effect. Okay. Oh, sorry, I'm on the wrong kind of graph here to draw it in that direction. It should be like this, right? Yeah. Right. So the price for producers gets pushed up, the price for consumers the price for consumers falls, price for producers goes up. Yeah, so that was not the inverse graph. And if you wanted to graph it, if you want to graph any of these producer surplus and consumer surplus and be consistent with the way we've done it in class, redraw the graph with capital A and capital C, right? So invert those supply and demand curves. Okay, so the producer surplus, consumer surplus measures, you don't have to do any of that graphical work. Just say they're shared the same way as the price incidence. I just did this, right? I just went up here and said this was the incidence before, that's the incidence now. And so I expect that whatever the total surplus is now, that 5/6 of it will go to producers and 1/6 of it will go to consumers, or if you prefer, 20% of it will go to the consumer surplus will now be 20% of producer surplus. It was 25%, but now it's producer surplus is 5 times as large because 1/6 times 5 is 5/6. Producers, we've already used this result up here, 1/30. Producers are going to capture about 3% more of any surplus in this market after this regulatory policy aimed at supply has been enacted. Okay, so it's an odd result. We think about regulation being restrictive, but and that's true, right? It definitely has dead weight effects, negative economic effects in the input market. But when you move to the supply market, if it makes you more inelastic, then any subsidies that were there are going to be slightly more, are going to be captured slightly more by the producer side. And that's an effect we see, right? So when we calculate the full effect of something like a regulation, we count, one, what is happening in the input market to producers, right? That they now no longer have this option that they wanted to produce with the most productive input. The regulation comes in and says you now have further restrictions, so you aren't allowed to do that. That's a negative impact in that market, but producers also exist in their output market. When they become more inelastic, they capture more of the subsidies. So it could be there's some offsetting effect that we would have to account for. Okay, part 3. This is a little bit different question, probably a little easier, because the sort of answers are there, and you just have to reverse engineer what does the market look like. And so this one isn't related to the above question, but it says to the previous questions, but it says pre and post taxation data shows that producer prices fell by about 5% while consumer prices increased by 15%. So what does that mean? Well, there was a market with no tax, and they added a tax to it, and we were able to track the producer side price and the consumer side price separately and saw how they sort of were differently impacted. So answer the following questions about that market where this tax got added. Okay, let's use these notes and work, and I'll talk through them to show you how I worked backwards through this information to answer the questions. So, first question, sorry, on the wrong page. First question, if the elasticity of supply is 0.5, what is the elasticity of demand? So, the question starts from the observed outcomes, the question starts with giving you observed outcomes after a policy change occurs. The other questions we've had say, here's the policy, tell us about the changes. This one says, here are the changes we saw. What do you now know about a market? So one of the ways we learn about markets is to observe pre and post policy effects. So one of the ways we're actually going to learn about the trade war, about what do, if you think about globalization, there's lots of theory about sort of what does it mean to keep increasing sort of the connectedness and comparative advantage across economies. Well, if you never disrupt that, and it only keeps getting sort of more integrated, I guess would be the right word, in terms of trade, then it's really hard to understand how those effects are playing out and what the sort of controlling parameters are. And so one of the things we learn when we do something like a trade war is we track the producer price effects here in this country, and to the extent that we can get consumer price effects in some other place, or the consumer prices here for the things that we're applying tariffs to, then you might be able to reverse engineer and understand what does it mean, how's the welfare, what's the effectiveness of this policy, and how do we go forward, or how do we learn about making better trade policy, or making a set of secondary policy decisions to offset some of the effects of the trade war. Okay, so that's the kind of thing that we're given here. So the producer price is falling, consumer price up. The tax impact on consumers is 3 times as large. That's the key effect, right? So we know that comparing these two, or if you wanted to, you could say the total effect is 20%, 15% of it, or 3/4 of it falls to the consumer side. However you want to think about it, just be consistent. But I'm saying that the tax impact 3 times as large for consumers as producers. That means that consumers are the inelastic side of the market. The price response on the producer side of the market needs to be 3 times as large. So you're getting 1/3 of the effect. You must be 3 times as elastic. Okay, and so with that, you can get to question A right away, and it says if that elasticity for supply is 0.5, what would the elasticity of demand be? Well, they need to be 1/3 as large, or this supply elasticity needs to be 3 times the demand elasticity. And so if you multiply that 1/3 times 1/2, you get 1/6. Nothing too special about that. The second question, if the equilibrium price was $40 per unit before a tax, what are the tax, producer, and consumer, after tax, consumer and producer prices? You move down here. I'm starting with a value that's 40. I gave you 5% reduction as the producer price, 15% increase as the consumer price. So just put this together as a price incidence equation. 0.95 is a 5% reduction to that price of 40, which is the pre-tax price, and you get $38. 15% increase, $46, and these two are 5% lower than, 15% higher than. Okay, don't need to do any of the elasticities or anything because I've already given you the percent adjustment. That has to hold up. If it doesn't, then we got problems elsewhere. So, just work with the simplest version of this. P star times the effect. P star times the effect. What is the third question? I think it asks for the tax. Sorry, scrolling a lot. Given the information from Part B, what was the size of the tax per unit? Size of the tax can only be one thing. It has to be the difference in the producer price and the consumer price. So don't get yourself into too many equations when it is simply a matter of saying this is a tax, consumer prices are above the free market price, producer prices are below the free market price. The total tax is shared between those two prices, producer and consumer prices. That gap has to be the tax. There's no way to collect anything extra or anything less as tax, and so it must be 46 minus 38, $8 per unit. The question didn't say that, but you could also have just added up these two. 15% of the tax, 15% of the price goes as tax to the producers, the consumers. 5% shows up as producers. Add those two together, and you get a 20% tax rate. That is it. That is our three example problems that were added on to the study guide quantitative question. So start with a problem like that. You could have the example questions that I gave you in this document. Sorry, a lot of notes before you get to those. So you could have questions like D and E, or you could have questions like we did in A, B, C here. I just want you to use a mix of drawing on the notes to use the right formula if that's your preferred way, or if your preferred way is just to explain it and say, because of the price response on the supply and demand side, I already know this. Use your words and explain it. Just whatever you're doing, be sure that you are meeting your communication requirement for someone who is going to read your exam and explaining your economics. All these problems are fairly simple, and they all at least intend to, whether you read it that way or not, the intention is to make them something that if you use a few of the basic concepts we've done on how producers and consumers respond to prices and how that affects, how that determines the effects of policy. That is all that's going on in these questions. So think of it in that regard. How could I use that ratio or that share of producer response and the total response to answer this question? If you do that, you're going to be fine. And it's not it says quantitative because we're producing quantitative results, not because we're doing difficult mathematics. Okay, that's the other part I want to be clear about. I do want to jump over to the study guide just to remind everyone. So you'll have 3 sections: a quantitative, a short answer, and an essay. The essay question is probably going to be something that we haven't specifically discussed, so it'll be some kind of new thing, and basically ask you to either use a combination of the policy objectives that we've talked about for farm policy. Okay, so that whole family farm survival, expanding farm production. So it'll be something about that, and it'll probably also ask you to make some distinct positive versus normative statements, right? And I'll give you the instructions to help you sort of organize that. So mostly because I want it to be easy to read and be easy to evaluate. So those are the main sort of high-level policy theory topics we had. What are people aiming for when they pass policies, and then what are economists using to organize the way we look at statements about policy, right? That was that positive versus normative. So on the essay question, I guess my point would be to organize your thoughts, but use whatever information is given to you. If I tell you to use a paragraph of positive statements, get those down in your head or on a separate piece of paper first, and then be sure you put them all in, right? Just make it, we're not looking for a beautiful essay. We're looking for something that is just clear communication, and obviously, since I'm expecting it to be done in 15 minutes, it's not going to be perfect. Don't make it perfect, but make it your best complete thought, given the time constraints. That's all I'm asking for there. Okay. And then I guess the other part that we haven't talked about too much is the multiple choice true false. So they'll be in two parts every time. The first one will say make your choice, multiple choice, or pick true or false. And then part two, just provide an explanation. So this is not it says essay, but what I mean is use sentences to provide an explanation. Yeah, not essay is the part 3 here. So part 2, just use a sentence or two to explain your thinking. So if I were to look at these, when I look at true or false, this is just a definition, right? Positive economic statement is one that offers a conclusion about how things should be. That should, when it says should there, it ought to trigger you to pick false. But if you don't, I'm not saying it's a lost cause. It's possible you pick true, but have an explanation that corrects yourself, and you lose very little credit for something like that. So short answer questions are a way to test definitions of things we've talked about in class. True or false, an application of something like a definition for positive versus normative statements. This one says true false. The following is a positive economic statement about ag policy. Pursuing the goal of expanding farm production will always support farm incomes because more output will increase farm incomes. Okay, well, I guess this could be either one. It is a positive economic statement because it's testable. That is the key part here. So if someone looks at all the policies that expand farm production and could find one that didn't necessarily increase farm incomes or support farm incomes, then they would have a rejection of that testable statement. You may choose to go a different way. You may say it's false because these goals are distinct, and as long as you make an explanation for that, that's fine. Here, probably the easiest answer to go with on a top 5%, cutting out the top 5% wealthiest farmers would probably be C, would make the easiest sort of explanation, because we tend to think of the wealthiest farmers probably not being as dependent on the farm income or for their sort of well-being, and then that's probably imposes a definition of family farming that says let's support family farming by looking at families whose major source of income is the farm operation, and that's where the subsidies should be concentrated. Okay, so however you want to explain that. It's probably not as easy to answer that with A and B, but you definitely could choose none of the above and come up with a good answer. Farm subsidies based on production of area planted. You could say A, you could say B, you could say C. You probably can't say D. So this one's going to be the hardest one, but you could give an answer for any of these and come up with an explanation. The sort of obvious answer is A and B, because when you put a subsidy in the land market, we expect both the renters and the leasers to share that subsidy. But if you say it's basically going to farmers, then there's a certain condition that you could explain that with, saying that they have all the inelasticity, and it's perfectly possible that a farmer is, I guess you might call it a monopsonist, right? So one large farmer is the only one competing for land to be rented in a market. They're very inelastic. They have all the market power, and a subsidy, they're able to capture it all. And then the opposite would be true here, sort of a monopolist. One person owns most of the land, and they decide how they want to rent it out. And whoever's willing to give them most of their subsidies in exchange for the opportunity to rent the land will be the ones to get it. Okay, yeah, so I just want you to do thoughtful, make a thoughtful choice that you're ready to support with a couple of sentences, and that's it on all of these short answer questions. Again, we're not looking for, if you just listen to me just then, you'll notice that I did not say which one was right or wrong, just which ones I think are easier to write a supporting statement for. And then be sure, the only way to really have difficulty with one of these questions is to write an explanation that indicates one of the other choices was better. If you pick A here, and you write an explanation that says that it should be C, that doesn't help me as much as picking A and then sticking to that and making your explanation about that. Anyway, these questions are going to be geared to guide you, hopefully to the easiest one, and sort of let you demonstrate the things you've learned, not just in this class, but anywhere in economics, right? I mean, this is a 400 level class. The idea is that all of your economics come with you when you take this class. So anyway, I'm excited to see what you guys do. I'm excited to get the exam in front of you and get the results back and start reading and evaluating, not individually, but really how prepared we are as a class to go into some secondary material. So with that, I'm going to cut this off. You'll have a short little quiz to follow this, and that is the required element. So go do your quiz now, and keep preparing for the exam.